Hi, welcome back to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope that you're having a beautiful day no matter what it is you're getting up to. Today I'd like to share with you an item that's kind of been requested a couple of times, but also stems from one of my very earliest wirework pieces back in 2014-2015. So I initially made a wirework cabochon based owl pendant, but it's kind of evolved over the years to be a little bit more inspired by the Nazca Lines of Peru. So I'm going to show you the little owl pendant that we're going to make today just here. I'm going to be working in raw copper wire in 3 gauges. 1.25mm, which is 16 gauge, 1mm, which is 18 gauge, and 0.4mm, which is 26 gauge. I've actually finally, after a year and a half, been able to remember some of those gauge comparisons. So he's pretty cute. He's not the most owly looking owl on the planet, but he's definitely just a cute little whimsical owl that you can make from wirework. And as I say, I've had a couple of lovely people ask if I can show you how to make a cabochon based owl pendant. So this is the evolution that we're going to work on today. If you'd like to join me down at the board, I will show you a little bit closer. So here we have our owl figure, and you can see, if you have ever seen the Nazca Lines of Peru, that there is a little bit of inspiration drawn from those figures that are visible from above. Incredibly beautiful pieces that one day I'd like to go and see for myself. So we're going to be working in those 3 different gauges of the wire. I've chosen to work in raw copper because I think it looks really beautiful with this kind of gemstone. This is natural golden tiger's eye. It has those beautiful ribbons and variations in colour, and the chatoyancy makes it something that's just a little bit special. So I'm going to pop the figure up in the corner. We're going to create this piece by working through various stages and creating some component parts. So these are the pieces that we'll be looking to create. So we have a frame, and this is going to be using the heavier, it's 1.25 or 16 gauge to make a frame to sit around our chosen cabochon. Would also look amazing in a beautiful sheen obsidian. There's a tail section made in 1mm or 18 gauge. The wings are made in 1mm and 18 gauge, and they come together to form part of the face as well. And then everything is held together with some finer gauge wire. You can choose whichever of the finer gauges you prefer, but I really enjoy working with 0.4mm 26 gauge, as it combines just enough visible amount on your design, but it's really super strong for its size. So that's my favourite of the weaving wires. So I know I've shown you how to create this frame several times, but that is indeed where we're going to start off with. If I just grab from the side, I'll show you how to do that if you've not done that before. So we're going to be working in portrait orientation, and I have here 10 inches or so of that 1.25mm 16 gauge wire. And what I'm going to do is grip hold of that really firmly at one end and just warm that really nicely between thumb and forefinger 3 or 4 times, just to get an element of warmth into it. And it really doesn't take much, just to get a little bit of extra heat. Now what I'm going to do is just press down very, very gently to start that curvature. If you prefer, you can use a form. I have a torch that my lovely friend Sissy sent through to me, which is almost the perfect size, so you could use a torch if you like, or a professional round mandrel. It's entirely up to you. That looks like a reasonably good place to start. So I'll actually want this to be not exactly precisely the same size, but pretty close. So I'm going to start drawing that in and up. You can use the pliers if you prefer. I have got my ever faithful sparkle handle bent chain nose pliers. They do pretty much anything I want them to be honest. They don't make a very good cup of coffee though, which is sad, because otherwise they'd be perfect. So what we need to do is to generate a complete circuit around that form. And again, you can use a mandrel if you like, or whatever tool you have to hand. The lid of a lotion bottle is usually pretty good. But you can get that form curving around using almost any round form that's hard and won't be scratched by you using it. So the raw copper wire is lovely because you can't scratch the surface, it's completely solid copper. And I'm going to just by eye draw that around to create an oval to fit over the top. If you want an incredibly elaborate bail up at the top, this is relatively simplistic. If you want an elaborate bail, do feel free to add to that 10 inches and make it something a little bit more spectacular. For me, 10 inches is plenty because it just gives me enough to create a little bit of woven bail at the top there, which we can create into a bail at the end of the design. So I do want that to replicate the shape of the cabochon that we're using. And then once you have that shape in position, you can put some uprights on. There we go. There are several tutorials on my channel which show you how to complete the bail, so we probably won't show you that today unless you specifically need to know. And then I can just pop a little link in to show you where you can find that information. So I'm going to grip both of those wires a little bit to the right of the centre, and the right hand wire is just going to have that upright pushed into it, bearing in mind this is the heavier gauge of wire to give a really good solid base to your design. If you like, you can do this in the 1mm or 18 gauge, it's entirely up to you, your preference. I like to have a nice solid centrepiece to work with. So I have opened up those uprights at the 12 o'clock position either side of, and I've left a gap in between so that you can put a woven bail into position. If you prefer, you can bring those closer up to the centre for a narrower bail. Entirely up to you how you customise your little owl pendant design. So I'm just going to bring that in ever so slightly and get a nice firm bend on there. If I flip that over again, I can show you. Grip where I'd like that to be sharper, and then just pull that out and back in a couple of times and you get a slightly firmer bend to work with. So the bail, as I say, can be found on many of the other tutorials on the channel. We're just going to work on the components for that owl today. Now, I am constantly asked where I get my inspiration from to create new designs, and honestly, a lot of it is my own back catalogue. I've made many pieces of jewellery over the last 11 years, so it's quite nice to go back and revisit the photographs I've taken of those pieces. You can be quite inspired by your own work and you can see, well, I wish I'd done such and such to that piece, and then you can do it because it's entirely up to you. You know, it's yours, it's there to be customised. But this one, as I say, is an evolution of a piece that started out about 6 or 7 years ago, and he's had a bit of a Nazca styling upgrade. So I hope that you enjoy this as much as I do. We're going to make the tail and wing sections next. So for the tail section, you could make this out of the heavier gauge wire if you prefer. You need about 9 inches or so. I'm working in 1mm gauge today. Now you can use round nose pliers, but if you do have access to some bail makers, it gives you a little bit more control over the design. So I'm going to find the centre piece of my 9 inches, sorry, the centre point of my 9-inch piece of wire. I'm using 1mm 18 gauge. You can up that if you prefer. So I'm looking to find the centre piece, the centre point, and then I'm going to decide that I want number 4 to be the size of those feather sections. So you can see we've got the centre is now nicely hairpin racetracked, and what I'm going to do is decide the length that I'd like. It's around about 1 inch on this design. If you want to size this up for wall decor, then you'll need a longer piece of wire, and I'm just going to hold very firmly in my bent chain nose pliers and get quite a skinny little loop coming back down. Now we don't want that to close up completely, but we do want to tighten it up slightly. So I'm going to flip that over and do the exact same thing on the other side, and my preference when I'm working with a section like this is to help me get a little better symmetry. I do it little by little. So I'm going to just define that bend a little bit more and give that a squeeze into position. So those, I'm quite happy with those. You could even make the side feathers for the tail section in a slightly smaller size. So this was the size we used for the central piece. And I'll show you what it looks like if you change the roundness or the diameter of that post. So I'm going to use the second smallest and just curl that around like so. It's quite nice to see that graduating up. And I'm going to do the same on the other side. Now each feather as it comes further out from the centre is shorter. If you wanted to, you could draw this out on a piece of paper so that you know you're going to get the exact same dimension each time. I'm going to eyeball it, as we say. And this is just to show you what it would look like if the tail feathers were smaller. If they're all the same size, it looks a little bit more regulation like so. Coming back in with those bent chain nose pliers, I want to take the next bend just a very small smidge of an amount, slightly more north. So again, coming back around before I straighten and tighten. The reason it's ever so slightly more northerly, and that might be just too much, I'm going to open that down slightly there, flip over and do the same on the other side, is because we'll be fitting this to a form which is at the base of that cabochon. It's at the base of the shape we've created, so to have just a little bit of curvature built in makes it fit more easily. It really does only need to be ever such a tiny amount. I think I've probably made that too deep, but we can address that as we go through. So I'm going to stick with the number 2 position, but what I am going to do is just tighten those curves up first. So I've brought that around ever so slightly, because I think it was too far to the north, and just pinched it between the tips of those pliers very, very gently. And again, I'm going to bring that down ever so gently on this side, straighten it up like so, and pinch that together. I will just give that a little bit of a straighten as well, just to try and keep those lines in good straight linear nature. If you feel that that's gone slightly awry, it's a very small amount of wire and you can just recreate that. For me, I'm just going to take an extra second to just bring that around, and then I'll be happy. Give that a squeeze down. And we're going to have one more tail feather. I'm going to stick with the number 2 position on my bail making pliers, but it is going to be incrementally shorter, like so. Flip that over to the other side, and you can roll those bail makers into position until they look to be at about the right distance from that top bend. So bring those 2 side sections in, and what I'm going to do is put little curls on them. Now you could make these curls very, very small just to see the difference. These are quite large coils up in the corner here, coils or curls as you prefer. The one thing that I would do is try to get these 2 ends trimmed to the same length to begin with. I think I might make these ones quite short, so I'll trim them to that crossing over point. It's a good way of measuring. Just trimmed those sections away, and then I would find my round nose pliers and just turn those over. Just going to make sure those are the same length. There we go. So what we're going to do is pop in with the end of those round nose pliers and just coil that around carefully. And again, it needs to be just a tiny amount further north than the first couple of bends, and in that way it will fit the base that we've created here. I'm going to flip that over. Again, I'm right dominant, so I find it easier to work in this orientation. You will find your own speed as you go through. Switching back to some flat facing pliers, I'm using my bent chain nose pliers. I'm just going to put a little bit of residual strength in those coils once I'm happy that they're in the position I want. Now another option that you have with this design is you can hammer it so that these sections are both stronger and flatter. But for the sake of expediency today, I'm just going to squeeze those important points up at the top and down at the bottom, just to try and keep that shape. As I say, you could take an extra few minutes just to hammer this down, and then you'll have a really lovely effect for your design. What I want to do is just open the feathers out very, very slightly, but not too much. And we're just going to see if that fits. What we can do is just stretch that to make it fit as you would like it to. And we'll be adding that on with some 0.4 or 26 gauge wire in a little moment. I do love to pop to the internet and be inspired by things from around the world that perhaps I won't have the opportunity to see for myself, or at least haven't yet seen for myself. So the Nazca Lines are super inspirational. There's a spaceman there, there's the most wonderful condor, there's a hummingbird, there's a monkey, there's lots and lots to be inspired by, and these can all kind of translate into wire work. Wire is beautiful in so much as you have this line and you can just keep turning that to your heart's desire until you can really give an expression of yourself through your jewellery or through your art. So we have our first couple of pieces created now, and I'll just pop that one over there as well. I haven't decided which one I want to use to draw it all together. The next thing that we're going to do is to create the eyes and wings. Now, there's so many different ways that you could create these. I just put a little bit of variance in the length of the feathers. The demonstration piece I have here has 4 ones at the end there and then just 1 at the top. There's no rhyme nor reason to it other than that's how I felt at that particular moment. This one's got 3 like little prongy parts and then just 1 at the top, and we'll see what that looks like in a moment. To create these you will need 2 equal lengths of the 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and these are approximately 6 inches in length. So I'm just going to give those a quick smooth through to make sure that they are indeed straight and flat, and then I will just trim them just to get those sharp edges away because I don't want to catch my hands on them. So we'll just make sure that they're also the same length. You may find that you need to trim them slightly anyway. I'm going to show you how to make them so that they're vaguely symmetrical. Now for this, I start at the eye section with quite a tight coil with a large open centre. So I'm starting maybe 1/8 of an inch down to 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to create quite an open circular feature to begin with. And then I'm going to start drawing the wire around. Swapping to my flat facing pliers, when I say a close coil, I mean we have created 1 circle. We're starting with a 2nd circuit around the first. We don't want that to be closed up. We want to see a little bit of airspace between them, but we don't want it to have too small a hole in the centre. You have the option of adding yourself in a very tiny faceted gemstone in there if you'd like to. I actually love the simplicity of just working with a single gemstone cabochon. So what I have to do now is try to recreate that a 2nd time. You could put permanent marker onto your pliers if you prefer to give yourself an idea of that starting point. What I tend to do is just pop that down and say, yeah, that's close enough. Move over to the flat facing pliers, my bent chain nose pliers, and continue around for that 2nd circuit. Now this is slightly open, so I just need to very, very gently close that end in and then create that 2nd circuit quite closely, but not completely against the first one. You can see I have a tiny fleck of copper on my finger. This is from the repeated trimming of the end of the sections of wire. What I'm going to do is very carefully get rid of that into the scrap pot because they can irritate their way under your skin, which is not fun. So if you do see one of those, just pop it out of the way. If you have pets or small children as well, it's worth keeping them well away. So what I'm going to do is just pop these one on top of the other and see if they're reasonably close, because they will be next to each other on the design. That works for me. As far as I can see, that looks pretty decent. So I'm going to hold these together while I make the first bend in the wire, and then I will move them into individual sections, because I'll show you the pitfalls actually. I'm going to come down around about 1 inch from the top of the coil, perhaps just slightly less than that. And I'm going to put my first hard bend back in like so. So we're at this section. What you can do is you can try to create them side by side all the way through, but the wire will often wiggle around and it's not as easy as you might think. So you can see already that the lower piece, because it's further down the pliers, is already moving apart. So I tend to get the first bend done, and then what I will do is I would just do these one at a time and then lay them on top of each other to kind of get that slightly finer check to make sure that they're reasonably accurate to one another. So I'm going to do 3 little blocks down at the bottom here. You could make those slightly more even. If you feel that you want to retry, you can just open that up ever so slightly and increase the size. Like so. If you want to recreate this particular design, I'm just going to squash that down flat quickly and just very, very gently draw each of those little prongs together like so. And what I'm going to do here is grip as if I was going to create another little bend down at the bottom. I'm going to push that in slightly. It's just passing underneath the eye circle at the top there. And then what I'm going to do is bring the pliers about halfway up from this bend to where it crosses the coil. Bring that back out. And I want to have a straight line with this section of wire now, before I pop the pliers back in. And it can be the same kind of distance down here. And I'm going to draw that all the way back up so that it just passes over the end of where those initial coils are. And I'm going to bring this end down in a coil of its own. So what I will do in a second is I'll put this flat down and just leave it there for a second. So if you need to refer to it, you can. So I've popped the coil coming back down like so. I just want to open that out ever so slightly, like so. And then I would repeat with this side, just going small section by small section to make sure that I can have two that are the same. So if I pop these out of the way and just pop this into the centre for a second, you can do a little sketch like I have on my notepad over to one side, or you can just do a quick screen grab if you need to. Those are the wing sections. So we now have our component parts, and what we need to do is sew everything together. So I would begin by adding the tail section, and this is the piece I've chosen to work with. I would add that onto the base of the pendant surround or frame that we've created. Now what I'm going to do is draw some 0.4mm or 26 gauge wire, and I'm going to add about 1.5 foot, around about 18 inches or so, which is equivalent to 45 centimetres. And that's just because I know that will see me part of the way through the project. If there are any wrinkled parts, I'm just going to discard them. Now this is very simply sewing together your piece. So I'm going to pop the tail section down and make sure that I'm happy with how that looks. So if I wanted that to be tighter up, what I could do is draw these sections down further. Or I could work with a piece that I made slightly more slowly, like so. So I think we'll probably work with this piece instead. And I'm just going to pop that down for a second, find the centre of my approximately 18 inches of the lighter gauge wire, and I'm going to wrap that probably 4 or 5 times around the centre, the 6 o'clock position of that pendant frame. So that's 1 and 2 and 3, 4, and visually that's 5 wraps, and I just need to centralise that. Those 5 wraps will need to line up with the gap in the centre of the tail section. So because the right hand side of my lightweight wrap is coming underneath the frame, I need to take that underneath the tail section and wrap that all around, and I'll probably give that 2 wraps on each section. Now I need these 2 sections of wire, the frame and the tail, to sit side by side, not to go on top or below. So I'm going to go for 2 wraps on the tail section and see what that looks like. That looks pretty neat. So what I'm then going to do is add another 5 wraps around the frame wire. So that's 1, 2, 3. This is just around the frame. 4 and 5, like so, before tidying that up. Just repeat all the way to either end so that that sits neatly and in position. So I'm just going to finish wrapping those sections together, and then I'll show you back down on the board what that looks like when you're completed. So what I've done is I have wrapped each section of the tail twice to the frame, and then there's 5 wraps in between each of those sections, and you'll see that there's a residue of wire available on the bottom of the design, and that's great because we can use that to attach the wing and eye section to the frame in a moment. I'm going to show you how to bring this part together now, and you will need to refer to both the frame and the cabochon to make sure that that's going to fit. What we're looking for is the outer coils to be outside the gemstone face and the inner coils to fit over the face. So to weave this together, I'm going to use another 18-inch length of that 0.4mm gauge wire. So that's approximately 45 centimetres, and that's 26 gauge. So I just pop the gem out of the way so I don't boink it onto the floor. What we're going to do is start by pinching these 2 sections together. And for the very central piece, you have the option of doing a back and forth very, very close weave, which I will show you how to do, or you can wrap around both of those in a circular formation, so wrapping around and around both of those wires before splitting out into a figure of 8 weave. So I like this design because it kind of looks like a little shiny bit of beak, but you can do that exactly how you want to. Just pop that up there for reference. So a quite close figure of 8 weave will start. I'm starting approximately 2/3 of the way along the wire to join just below where those 2 eye coils are. So I'm going to wrap maybe twice around one side before dropping the other side super close. I've gone down the centre, so I'm going to come up and around 1 and 2 on the other side, down the centre, draw it underneath, 1 and 2, flip to the other side, 1 and 2. And we've got a little bit of space in these eye coils so that we can just run the wire through the gap, and that will work quite nicely. If they're too tight, you won't be able to get the wire past, and then you'll have to start posting that in between, which is not a great drama. If they are quite tight, I can show you how to do that. So pinching very, very firmly with the non-dominant hand is the key to having this stay where you want it to. If your eye coils are a bit tight, you just take the very end of that wire and post it up inside the outer of those 2 circles. It's just a little more time consuming. So up around the outside of those 2 coils, and then the same on this side. That's only if it's a little bit too tight, because you can fit it through otherwise. And then you'll just truncate that as and when you feel you're pleased with the aesthetics of it. You can add spike weave in a very, very fine gauge around the top of the eyes if you want to. It makes it slightly more advanced, but it makes for a beautiful owl eye design. I'm going to finish off on one side with 2 wraps, like so. I think that's probably high enough for my design idea for today. I'm going to cut on what will be the back, reserve that section because you will find use for a couple of inches of a lighter gauge weaving wire all the time. So I'm just going to tidy up that little end so it doesn't stick out, push that down into position and very, very gently squeeze that together. Now a little bit further down, we just want to double check again that these outside coils are still outside the margins of the gemstone. And then we're going to again pinch very, very firmly and continue with that 2 and 2 figure of 8 weave. And that's one of the reasons we've got these open wing sections, is to make our lives easier. This is towards beginners to intermediate level project. So even if you have very little wrapping experience, you should be able to at least have a bit of a go and learn something as you go through the process. So it's 2 wraps around, 2 coils around on either side as you're moving down the project. And then you can just trim that away whenever you want to. Now for me, because I finished on the left-hand side at the top, I will probably want to finish my weaving on the right-hand side at the bottom. So when you feel you've gone far enough, you don't have to replicate that aspect of asymmetry, or however you want to finish that off. I think I'll do another 2. Another 1 there, second time around, and then 2 on this side. And I'll make sure that's nice and close to the back before I trim that finer gauge wire away. Again, this will be useful, don't discard it, but do make sure that you squish down that end tail of the finer gauge wire. Now hopefully you can see that this is starting to come together in our quite whimsical little owl. So the next thing that we will want to do is just apply a little bit of shape to this front section. And all I'm going to do is just bring the outer wings down slightly, very, very slight amount, and just pop that over the design like so. And then we will need to assess whereabouts on the frame those wings at the bottom will intersect with the frame wire. So I'm just going to make sure that there's enough space, because it's a reasonably domed cabochon. I need to have enough flexibility for the owl form to sit slightly proud of the frame, not completely flat down. So I think I'm going to take the tail of wire and pop it around the base section in here. You just got to find where it fits best. And if I just do that first wrap really softly, I can see that I can symmetrically match that on the other side. Now, if the feathers are coming down over the tail, that's all part and parcel of what an owl actually looks like, so it's no big deal. So I'm going to wrap the feather section to the frame, and I'm going to replicate those 2 circuits of the frame and the feathers like we did with the 2 circuits around the tail and the frame. And then I'm going to continue wrapping up the frame itself. So that's 1, and I'll probably do that 5 times. 2, a little bit tricky, but not impossible. It's only tricky because I'm trying to make it visible for you. So that's a 4th wrap, and then a 5th wrap. So what I'm going to do in a second is just repeat that on the other side, but I don't suppose you'll need to see that both times. You can just see that it's in position, ready to be wrapped. So I'll just crack on with that, and then we'll reconvene to add the rest of the design together. So I've just repeated on the left-hand side as I did on the right-hand side, attaching in a symmetrical fashion the wing form down at the base of the frame, and I'll show you that now. So you can see that they are symmetrically attached in a similar position. And as you practice, that will be much easier to find that symmetry. But you can see we've got a bit of space up here to work with. What I am going to do is just very, very gently put my finger under the nose and eye, or beak and eye section, and just draw that slightly rounded. So you can see there's an element of just raising it up so that that cabochon will fit neatly into position. Pop the cab out of the way. So the next thing we need to do is to make sure that the wing section sits on the frame. It can sit on the top, which I actually think is a really nice aesthetic, but those eyes are a little bit close together, which is not a problem, because all we will need to do is just very, very gently draw one out one side, and little by little, equal and opposite. If you're going to bring it out a 1/16 of an inch on this side, do a 1/16 of an inch on this side, before you decide if that's enough space. So I think that probably is enough space between those eyes now. That looks reasonably symmetrical. If you're unhappy, you can obviously spend a little bit more time making sure that that's exactly how you want it to be. Now, those scraps of wire that we put to one side earlier, this is just scraps of the 0.4 or 26 gauge raw copper wire. And I'm going to show you on one side how to draw this all together to make it safe. So I would start by wrapping 5 times around the frame, very near to that outer loop on the wing. So it's tricky to show you, but the process is exactly the same as all of the other wrapping we've been doing. So I'm just going to take it 3 times around with the longer side of my wire. The reason I'm doing this is just to be thrifty. So I have wrapped 3 times. That means that I can just take this tail and use as much of it as I can possibly get away with, so there's less waste. You can try wrapping from the very, very end of the wire if you prefer, but it can be quite pokey in your fingertips. So there is a little bit of wastage, but not quite as much as we would have had before. You can also pick up your scraps with your pliers to save your fingertips. So I'm just going to make sure that that coil is nice and smooth. And yes, it's up very high, but that's fine, because we're just going to slide that down now so that it sits in the correct position. I'm going to pop this out to the side slightly so that you can see the end of my wire, which is at the top of that coil, is going to come up inside that loop we've made at the top of the wing. The wire's a little bit tired because it's a scrap, so I'm just going to sit that over the top of the frame and wrap twice around the frame and the loop. So 5 times around just the frame, and then twice around the frame and the top loop on those wings. Make sure that that's coming up the correct side. Just neaten that up either with pliers or fingertips. Now you can wrap the eyes to the frame or the eyes to the loop. It's entirely up to you. I think for this piece I'm going to take the frame to the eyes. So I'm going to come over the top and around. I'll probably just do the frame by itself 5 times. 2, 3, 4, and a 5th time. Make sure that's nice and tight. And I'm going to take the tail inside the outer coil that forms the right eye. So you see the wires coming down here. Pull that against and on top of the frame, and I want it on top because I want to have lots of space for my beautiful cabochon of tiger's eye to fit. So that's once and then twice around the eye and the frame. Push that down neatly, and then I'll finish off with 5 wraps around just the frame. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 5th time. I'm going to scooch that up super firmly. So what I'd like to do is have the end of that wire finishing where the gemstone will cover it up. So I'm going to get right down inside that frame and just cut away that last section of wire. Now, because this was acting as though it's a little bit stressed, I am now going to put this in the melt pot. And that's how you would be attaching the eye and the wing top to the framework. I'm going to show you the alternative, which is where along the side here, I've wrapped the wing to the frame and then the wing to the eye. On this one, I've wrapped the wing to the frame and then the frame to the eye. That's just how it worked out. So in a moment, I'll do the exact same process on the other side for the sake of symmetry. And then I'll show you how you can sew the back in to create your security on the rear side of that cabochon. So I've just finished off adding the left hand wing, top and eyes to the frame in exactly the same way. I'll just chat you through that very quickly now. So as you can see, I've added the connecting section of weaving wire, which is 0.426 gauge, to bring the top wing curl and the eye coil to the framework nice and securely. So really all that remains for us to do now is to pop our cabochon into position. I would always give that a quick polish before popping it into the framework, and just check that you're happy with the orientation of the gemstone. Sometimes with a natural gem like tiger's eye, you will prefer to see a particular way up, so just check that that's how you want it to be before proceeding. I'm going to just flip that over onto the face now, and we're going to use a further piece. It's around about 18 inches, 45 centimetres of that lighter gauge wire, which is 0.4mm gauge or 26 gauge. And all we will do for this section is run back and forth, side to side, just to make sure that the cabochon does not move out of position. So to begin with, we would need to find somewhere to attach the wire to the framework. So I'm going to attach it just close to the top corner. I'm going to draw that end section around at least 3 to 4 times. What I might do, because we've been using the number 5 in our wrap, is go for a 5 wraps, just so that we can replicate that when we come to the end. You don't have to, but as long as you've got a good 3 wraps around there to maintain security. Once you've got the desired number of wraps to attach your wire on, what we're going to do is trim the end away so that the end sits inside the frame wire, so that it will be obscured by the gemstone itself and it shouldn't come to any harm. So I'm just going to elevate that wire away from the frame. We're going to again check the orientation of your gem, check for thumbprints, and then you would just go from point to point. It's a process that I teach very frequently because it's accessible for people who are new to wire work, and it is very successful. I've got very old pendants, sort of 7 years old, that are put together with this process, and they're still going, so it's all good. So it's just a case of finding positions on the frame wire, one of the reasons we make it with heavy gauge wire, and just adding the wire around. So I'm going to go to the central bottom of that frame wire, and what I'm going to do is just move that cab out of the way slightly, so that I can get the end of the finer gauge wire down between the frame and the cab, and just draw that carefully down to what is essentially the 6 o'clock position. So I'm going to pull that down and all the way firmly into position. So what I want to do is bring this small finer gauge wire up into where those coils took place at the very base of the framework. So I'm just going to push that wire up and through. And if you pull firmly, what you can find is that you can just nestle that away secretly and invisibly into that wire wrapping at the base. I'm going to twist that around, and you can see that already we've got that V shape coming along, which is a good secure place to start. So what I might do here is come 5 times around the framework so that we're kind of replicating what you see on the face of the design. These won't be our only wraps around the frame, but it will make sure that we replicate where the eye may be drawn. If it doesn't go according to plan, you can always hide it with a little bit of decor later. And then all you would do is continue point to point around positions on the framework. So it's just repeating, and then when you get to the end, making sure that you snuggle the very end wire away to the inside of that framework. I'll show you the piece that I made to demonstrate with. So it's got that V position to begin with, and then just back and forth. You can be really very, very pretty with this. You can make patterns, and you can also, if you feel insecure about your wire work, add extra wraps to bring the wings to the framework. So you could just wrap twice around the frame and the inner section of the wing here before returning to the opposite side. So always kind of try and get some symmetry in there. So I hope that you've enjoyed making the small owl cab pendant with me today. I think he's quite charming, really, he or she. They're adorable. I'm going to call this one Mochuelo again because I think Little Brown Owl is deserving of his own name. Have lots of fun with that. You can obviously make whatever designs that you like, but I hope that that's been of help with the techniques and a little bit inspirational, hopefully. Enjoy making jewellery, and I look forward to seeing you back here again on the Gemhawks YouTube channel. Do also join me on Instagram and Twitter and of course Facebook. Every other Monday on Facebook I host a live show where I sell gemstone cabs, strands, and all sorts of chatter and malarkey goes on. I look forward to seeing you again. Bye for now.